The birds circled the slate roof of the Dovecote in the fading amber light of a Tuesday evening, their wings cutting tight, anxious arcs in the cooling air. They had returned from their training flight, homing back to Marlow Crossing, but there was no one to open the loft traps. Below them, at the foot of a wooden ladder angled sharply against the painted wood, lay Arthur Finch, his neck broken, his racing almanac scattered in the dust. "Hello friends, I'm Jack, coming to you from right here in Ohio, and welcome to Midnight Pages." Chapter 1. The Birds Come Home. Marlow Crossing in the mid-20th century was a village that existed in two distinct planes. There was the Marlow of the ground, the butcher's shop with its striped awning, the slow, muddy curve of the river Ouse, the pub where the same 6 men drank the same dark ale every Tuesday, and the post office where Mrs. Doris Lumley observed the ebb and flow of paper and secrets. And then, there was the Marlow of the sky. Pigeon racing was not merely a hobby in this part of England, it was a religion, governed by strict rituals, bitter rivalries, and the kind of silent, desperate hope that only working men who look upward for salvation can truly understand. Every Saturday from May to September, the sky above the village would suddenly fracture with the frantic, beating wings of returning birds, racing home from 50, 100, or 300 miles away, carrying the pride and the wages of their owners on their fragile, banded legs. Arthur Finch was a man who belonged almost entirely to the sky. At 58, he was a slight, spare man with a face that seemed perpetually tipped upward, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. He lived alone in a small, damp cottage at the edge of the village, a house that seemed merely an afterthought to the grand, 2-story wooden dovecote he had built at the end of his long, straggling garden. He was a familiar, if somewhat aloof, figure, usually seen cycling to the railway station with his wicker baskets, murmuring to the rustling creatures inside. He seemed a harmless man, entirely consumed by the pedigree, the diet, and the flight times of his flock. And yet, on this particular Tuesday evening, as the shadows lengthened and the first damp chill of autumn crept out from the riverbanks, Arthur Finch lay dead in the dirt, his life extinguished in a single, violent plummet. It was young Tommy Clark, the baker's boy, who found him. Tommy had been taking a shortcut across the fields behind Finch's cottage when he noticed the birds. They were not settling on the roof of the loft as they normally did, strutting and cooing as they waited for their evening feed. Instead, they were flying in agitated circles, a restless, hovering cloud, dipping low toward the garden and then sweeping back up again in panic. Tommy pushed open the rickety wooden gate and walked up the path, calling out Arthur's name. He stopped dead when he rounded the corner of the shed. Arthur lay on his back, his head twisted at an angle that the human spine was not designed to accommodate. His eyes were open, staring blankly up at the circling flock he could no longer tend. The heavy wooden ladder, which he used to reach the upper tiers of the loft, lay several feet away, knocked entirely clear of the structure. It did not look as though it had simply slipped, it looked as though it had been violently shoved. Near his outstretched right hand, lying open in the dirt, was his racing almanac, a thick, black, leather-bound book with dog-eared pages and cramped, meticulous handwriting. It was the Bible of Arthur's existence, the record of every bird he owned, every race they had flown, every penny they had won. Now, a thin smattering of topsoil had blown across the open pages, blurring the neat columns of ink. By the time the village constable had been summoned, and in turn had telephoned the county police station, the light had completely failed. Inspector Loach arrived just as the village was pulling its curtains against the night. Loach was a solid, methodical man in his late 40s, who did not much care for mysteries. He preferred facts, motives that could be counted in shillings, and weapons that left a satisfyingly obvious mark. He stood over the body, the beam of his heavy torch sweeping over the scene. He noted the angle of the ladder. He noted the deep, scuffed gouge in the earth where the ladder's feet had rested, a mark that suggested a sudden, horizontal force rather than a vertical collapse. And he noted the almanac. He bent down with a grunt, picking up the book by its corners. He brushed the dirt from the open page. It was a record of the birds currently in the loft, a list of names and ring numbers. His torchlight caught 2 entries near the bottom of the page, written with a slightly heavier pressure of the pen, as though the writer had paused, considered, and then pressed down hard. Arthur Finch, the Loft 7. Ring 4471 Ray. Arthur Finch, the Loft 7. Ring 4473 A. It meant nothing to the inspector at that moment. Just numbers on a page. He closed the book and handed it to a constable, turning his attention back to the silent figure on the ground. Up above, in the darkness, the birds had finally settled on the roof of the Dovecote, their soft, mournful cooing the only sound in the garden. They sounded, to the inspector's unpoetic ear, like a group of mourners who had forgotten the words to the hymn. The village was quiet, but it was a waiting quiet, the kind that precedes a storm. Chapter 2. The Ladder and the Loft. The following morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of crisp English autumn day that makes the countryside look as though it has been newly painted. Miss Jane Marple, who was spending a fortnight at the Blue Boar Inn while her own cottage in St. Mary Mead underwent a rather disruptive bout of replumbing, was taking her morning constitutional down the High Street. She walked slowly, a frail-looking figure in her tweed suit and sensible shoes, her pale blue eyes taking in everything with the benign, slightly unfocused gaze of an elderly lady who has misplaced her spectacles. In truth, Miss Marple missed very little. She had already observed that the baker's boy was looking unusually pale, that the butcher was arguing with his wife in a hushed, furious whisper behind the black puddings, and that an unmarked police car was parked at the edge of the village, near the lane that led to Arthur Finch's cottage. Inspector Loach was already at the scene, standing in the middle of Finch's kitchen, looking exasperated. He had spent the first 2 hours of his morning interviewing Finch's immediate neighbours, a process that had yielded an abundance of opinions but very few facts. Finch, it seemed, was a man who lived entirely for his birds. He had no close friends, no known enemies, and no money to speak of. His cottage was a testament to his single-mindedness. It was sparse, almost monastic. There were no photographs on the mantelpiece, no comfortable armchairs, no books save for several bound volumes of the Racing Pigeon magazine. The air in the house smelled faintly of grain, old feathers, and carbolic soap. Loach walked back out into the garden, making his way toward the Dovecote. The constable had managed to coax the birds into the loft and close the traps, but the structure itself was still cordoned off. Loach stood at the base, looking at the scuff marks in the dirt. He was joined a moment later by the police surgeon, a tired-looking man who smelled strongly of peppermint. "Well?" Loach asked, lighting a cigarette. "Broken neck," the surgeon replied cheerfully. "Instantaneous." He fell from a height of perhaps 8 to 10 feet, landing awkwardly on the back of his head. Time of death, roughly 6 o'clock yesterday evening. Could it have been an accident? Loach asked, staring at the ladder. Possible, the surgeon conceded. A man of his age, losing his balance, pitching backward. But look at the ladder, Inspector. If he had simply fallen, the ladder might have remained standing, or fallen backward with him. but it's been knocked sideways, clear of his body. And with considerable force. I'd say someone gave it a very firm kick while he was up there. Loach nodded grimly. He had thought as much. Any sign of a struggle beforehand? None. His fingernails are clean, no defensive wounds. Whoever pushed him, he probably didn't see it coming. He was likely reaching into the upper loft, tending to a bird, completely focused. Loach thanked the surgeon and walked over to the workbench set up against the side of the shed. It was where Finch had clearly spent a great deal of his time. There were small tins of specialized feed, tiny bottles of tonic, a pair of tweezers, and a small wooden box filled with aluminum pigeon rings. Loach picked up the Almanac, which the constable had bagged in clear plastic. He flipped it open to the page he had noticed the night before. The numbers stared back at him. 4471A, 4473A. Excuse me, Inspector. Loach turned to see Constable Davies approaching, looking slightly nervous. What is it, Davies? I was just down at the pub, sir, asking a few questions. The locals are talking. It seems Mr. Finch had a bit of a row recently. Very public, too. With whom? A man named Bernard Ashe, sir. Another pigeon fancier in the village. Apparently, they had a massive falling out at the end of last season over a race result. Ashe claimed Finch cheated him out of a win. He's been nursing a grievance ever since, telling anyone who'd listen that Finch owed him money and a trophy. Loach's eyes narrowed. A motive? It was petty, perhaps, but Loach had seen men killed over less than a silver cup and a few pounds in prize money. Where does this Bernard Ashe live? Just up the road, sir. Top of the hill. Right. Let's go have a chat with Mr. Ashe. As Loach walked back toward his car, he did not notice the elderly lady in the tweed suit, standing by the hedgerow on the opposite side of the lane, appearing to be deeply fascinated by a tangle of wild briar. Miss Marple watched the inspector drive away, her mind slowly turning over the fragments she had gathered over breakfast at the inn. A dead man, a toppled ladder, and a village full of birds. It was a curious puzzle, and she felt a familiar, quiet stirring of interest. She adjusted her hat, and began the slow walk back toward the post office. There was always much to be learned at a village post office. Chapter 3. What Mrs. Lumley noticed. The Marlow Crossing post office was a small, cluttered room attached to the front of Doris Lumley's house. It smelled of sealing wax, ink pads, and the sharp tang of boiled sweets kept in jars on the counter. Mrs. Lumley herself was a formidable woman in her early 60s, with a rigidly permed head of grey hair and a pair of spectacles that hung from a silver chain around her neck, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice to scrutinize a questionable postmark or a suspicious handwriting. She was currently engaged in sorting the morning mail, her hands moving with the brisk, practiced efficiency of a woman who has spent 30 years categorizing the lives of her neighbors into neat, rectangular bundles. The bell above the door gave a sharp ting, and Miss Marple stepped inside, bringing with her a breath of crisp autumn air. "Good morning, Mrs. Lumley," Miss Marple said cheerfully, stepping up to the counter. "I wonder if I might purchase a book of stamps? The blue ones, if you have them. I find they look so much more elegant on a white envelope, don't you think?" "Morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Lumley replied, her hands not breaking their rhythm. She liked the elderly lady from St. Mary Mead. She was polite, she never tried to pay with a large note for a small purchase, and she seemed to possess a sensible, unsentimental view of the world. Dreadful business about Arthur Finch, isn't it? Oh, quite dreadful, Miss Marple agreed, opening her handbag and searching for her coin purse. Such a shock for the village. They are saying it was an accident, of course. Mrs. Lumley snorted softly, a sound that conveyed a lifetime of skepticism. Accident. HMPH. Arthur Finch knew every rung of that ladder like the back of his hand. He practically lived up there. Men like that don't just fall, Miss Marple. Not unless they're helped. You knew him well, then? As well as anyone did. He came in here every Wednesday to post his entry forms for the races. Kept to himself, mostly. Never had a kind word for a soul, unless that soul happened to have feathers and a beak. She paused, sliding a book of stamps across the counter. Though, I will say, he'd been acting a bit different lately. Miss Marple paused, her fingers hovering over her purse. Different? In what way, Mrs. Lumley? Mrs. Lumley leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice, though the shop was entirely empty. Well, you know how these pigeon men are. Always worrying about the weather, or the wind, or whether their best bird has caught a chill. A nervous lot, generally. But Mr. Finch, he always looked so pleased with himself on race mornings. She picked up a letter, examined the address, and tossed it into a sorting bin. It wasn't just the pride of winning, mind you. I've seen men win. They look relieved, mostly. But Arthur, he looked like a man with a secret, not just a hobby. Like he knew something the rest of the world didn't. A very smug sort of look, if you take my meaning. Miss Marple paid for her stamps, her mind turning over the phrase. A man with a secret. Smugness. In her experience, smugness was a dangerous quality. It usually implied that someone believed they had outsmarted a system or a person, and such beliefs often led to a tragic lack of caution. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured, placing the stamps in her bag. And the racing, it is a very serious business here, isn't it? Serious? Mrs. Lumley threw her hands up. It's madness, is what it is. Half the men in this village spend their entire wages on feed and timing clocks, while their children run about with holes in their shoes. And the betting! You wouldn't believe the money that changes hands, Miss Marple. Especially for the big ones, like the Marlow-to-Hinton Derby this coming Saturday. It's the premier race of the season. Arthur Finch had a bird entered, of course. Always did. Though who will handle it now, the Lord only knows. The Marlow-to-Hinton Derby, Miss Marple repeated softly. A very big race. The biggest locally. 50 miles across county lines. The whole village turns out for the return. Though, Mrs. Lumley added darkly, I suspect the atmosphere will be rather different this year. With Arthur gone, and Bernard Ash shouting his mouth off at the pub every night. Miss Marple's ears pricked up, though her expression remained one of mild, polite interest. Mr. Ash? Is he another fancier? Oh, yes. And a more bad-tempered man you couldn't hope to meet. He's had a grudge against Arthur since last August. Claimed Arthur's bird only won because of some trick with the timing clock. Nonsense, of course. Arthur was many things, but he took the rules of the sport as gospel. Miss Marple thanked the postmistress and stepped back out onto the street. The sun had risen higher, burning off the morning mist. She walked slowly, her mind occupied not with the violence of the murder, but with the quiet, domestic details that surrounded it. A ladder kicked away. A bitter rival. A man looking smug on a race morning. It was a tangle, certainly. But Miss Marple had spent a lifetime untangling the complex knots of human nature in St. Mary Mead, and she knew that the threads of a murder were rarely woven from sudden, inexplicable madness. They were usually woven from the oldest, most ordinary materials: greed, fear, and pride. She walked toward the inn, thinking about men who look pleased with themselves, and the secrets they take with them when they fall. Chapter 4. The Ring Numbers. The local police station in Marlow Crossing was little more than a converted front room in a brick terrace, smelling sharply of floor wax and stale tobacco. Inspector Loach sat behind a battered wooden desk, staring at Arthur Finch's racing almanac. He had brought it back from the scene, hoping the meticulous handwriting might offer a clue, a name, a discrepancy. Instead, it offered only a dizzying array of dates, weather conditions, and ring numbers. He was interrupted by a polite tap at the glass of the door. He looked up to see the elderly lady from the Blue Boar Inn, the one he had seen hovering near the hedgerow that morning. "Excuse me, Inspector," Miss Marple said, stepping inside with an apologetic smile. "I do hope I am not intruding. The constable at the desk said you might spare me a moment. I am Jane Marple. I am staying at the inn." Loach sighed inwardly. He was a patient man, but he had little time for elderly tourists who wanted to discuss the village gossip. "What can I do for you, Miss Marple?" "If it's about the Finch case, I'm afraid I cannot discuss police business." "Oh, I entirely understand," she said, taking a seat opposite his desk without being asked. "It's just that, well, I couldn't help but notice you examining that ledger this morning at the cottage. And it reminded me so forcefully of a curate I once knew in St. Mary Mead, a Mr. Harmon." Loach blinked, thrown slightly off balance. "A curate?" "Yes. A lovely young man, but terribly, terribly organized. He kept the most meticulous records of his bees. Hive populations, flight times, honey yield per frame. He had volumes of it. And it all looked terribly official and scientific." She smoothed her skirt over her knees, her eyes bright and clear. "Until, of course, someone realized that his flight times for the Queen's corresponded exactly with the afternoons he was seen riding his bicycle to a neighboring village to visit a rather lonely, married parishioner. The honey yields were, I believe, a record of the small gifts he purchased for her." Loach stared at her, the cogs in his procedural mind stalling for a moment before engaging again. "You're saying the almanac is a code?" "I am saying, Inspector, that a plain, official document is often the very best place to hide a private lie. It hides a private lie inside a public truth. People expect a pigeon fancier to write down numbers. Therefore, they do not look closely at what those numbers actually mean." Loach looked down at the book. He felt a sudden, grudging respect for the old woman. She had a point. He pushed the book across the desk toward her. "Look at this page." The last page he wrote on. "What do you see?" Miss Marple produced a pair of spectacles from her handbag and perched them on her nose. She leaned forward, studying the page with intense concentration. "It appears to be a list of birds currently in his loft," she said softly. "The dates of their hatching, their lineage, and their ring numbers. And here, at the bottom, the two entries you were looking at earlier. Arthur Finch, the Loft 7. Ring 4471 Ray and Arthur Finch, the Loft 7. Ring 4473 A. Exactly, Loach said. Just numbers. But look at the columns next to them, Inspector. Miss Marple pointed a gloved finger at the page. This book is a record of his entire flock. For every other bird, there are pages and pages of notes. Race times, training flight distances, diet adjustments. A complete history. She tapped the entry for 4471 array, but for these two birds, there is almost nothing. They are registered here, in his loft, under his name. But they have no race history. No training notes. They are, essentially, ghosts. Loach frowned, pulling the book back toward him. She was right. The entries were oddly sparse. Why keep a bird if you don't fly it? Perhaps they do fly, Miss Marple suggested gently. But perhaps they do not fly in the official races. Or perhaps they do not belong to Mr. Finch at all, despite what the book says. Loach leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. The case was beginning to shift, moving away from a simple, violent argument into something darker, something planned. I've got the official Racing Association transfer records coming in from London tomorrow, Loach muttered, almost to himself. Every registered ring has to be tracked. If these birds came from somewhere else, we'll find out. I think that would be very wise, Inspector, Miss Marple said, rising to her feet. And I would pay particular attention to the Marlow-to-Hinton Derby this Saturday. It seems Mr. Finch had a bird entered. He did. I checked the roster. He entered 4471 Ray. Miss Marple paused at the door, her hand on the knob. A ghost bird, with no race history, entered into the biggest race of the season. A man with a secret, she whispered, echoing the postmistress. Pardon? Loach asked. Nothing, Inspector. Just an old woman thinking aloud. I shall leave you to your work. As she stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, Miss Marple felt the shape of the puzzle solidifying. The almanac was a mask. The birds were tools. And Arthur Finch had been killed not in a fit of sudden rage, but because his secret had finally become too dangerous to keep. Chapter 5. Bernard Ashe makes his case. The Black Swan was the kind of pub that smelled of old wood, spilled bitter, and generational damp. At 8 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, it was crowded with the men of Marlow Crossing, their faces flushed with warmth and argument. The topic, inevitably, was Arthur Finch. Inspector Loach had chosen a small table in the corner, nursing a half-pint of ale and watching the room. He had intentionally worn a tweed jacket instead of his uniform, though he knew perfectly well that every man in the room recognized him. He was there to listen. Miss Marple was also there, seated at a small table near the fireplace, sipping a glass of dry sherry and working quietly on a piece of knitting. She appeared entirely absorbed in counting stitches, a harmless fixture of the background. At the bar, holding court with a pint glass gripped tightly in his meaty fist, was Bernard Ashe. He was a large, florid man of 45, with a voice that seemed designed to carry across windy fields. Tonight, it was carrying across the pub, thick with anger and defensive bluster. "I'm telling you, the man was a crook!" Ashe bellowed, slamming his glass down on the sticky wood. "A bloody crook! And now everyone looks at me as if I've done him in just because I had the guts to say it to his face. A murmur went around the men at the bar. Some looked uncomfortable, glancing nervously toward the corner where Loach Saturday. Others nodded in silent agreement. He stole that race last August, Ash continued, his face turning a deeper shade of red. My blue checker, Lightning, came in a full 2 minutes ahead of his bird. I saw it hit the trap. We all saw it. But when the official timing clock was opened, suddenly Finch's bird had miraculous time. Magic, it was. Come off it, Bernard, a thin man next to him muttered. The clock is the clock. You can't argue with the rubber ring. You can if the clock's been tampered with. Ash roared. Or if the man running the shed is looking the other way. I told him. I stood right in his garden last week and I told him, Arthur, you're a cheat, and one day someone's going to make you pay for it. I didn't mean I was going to do it, for God's sake. Loach stood up slowly and walked over to the bar. The pub went deathly quiet. Mr. Ash, Loach said, his voice calm, cutting through the silence. You admit you threatened Arthur Finch last week. Ash spun around, his chest heaving. He looked at the inspector, a sudden flash of panic breaking through the anger in his eyes. I didn't threaten his life, Inspector. I meant he'd get his comeuppance in the community. That he'd be found out. Where were you yesterday evening, Mr. Ash? Between 5 and 7 o'clock. Ash wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes darting around the room. The bravado had entirely vanished, replaced by the cornered look of a trapped animal. I was out. Driving back from the Breeders' Market in Oakhaven. It's 40 miles away. I didn't get back to Marlow until 8:30. Can anyone verify that? Loach pressed. I bought a dozen bags of specialized feed. I've got the receipt. And there were people there. Hundreds of them. I spoke to 3 different breeders. Ash's voice cracked slightly. I didn't kill him, Inspector. I hated the miserable sod, but I wouldn't push a man off a ladder. It's cowardly. Loach studied him for a long moment. Ash had motive, he had a public grievance, and his temper was clearly volatile. He was the perfect suspect. I'll need to see that receipt, Mr. Ash. And the names of the breeders you spoke to. First thing tomorrow morning. You'll have them, Ash said sullenly, turning back to his beer. Loach turned and walked out of the pub, his mind made up. Bernard Ash was his man. He just needed to break the alibi. By the fireplace, Miss Marple paused her knitting. She had watched the entire exchange, her eyes fixed not on Ash's face, but on his hands. When he had shouted his threats, his hands had been clenched, powerful, aggressive. But when the inspector had questioned him about the murder, his hands had trembled. He had gripped his glass not in anger, but in fear. Miss Marple had seen genuine murderers caught in lies. They were usually icy, calculating, their anger controlled and used as a weapon. Bernard Ash's anger was a chaotic, uncontrolled thing. He was a man deeply aggrieved by a perceived injustice, yes. But Miss Marple felt, with a quiet certainty, that he was not a man who would sneak up behind a rival and kick a ladder out from under him. His rage was too loud, too honest. The murder of Arthur Finch had been quiet, efficient, and cold. And it had everything to do with the race on Saturday, and a ghost bird named 4471 Ray. She took a delicate sip of her sherry. Inspector Loach was looking in the wrong direction, blinded by the glare of an obvious motive. The real secret was still hiding in the dark. Chapter 6. The Marlow-to-Hinton Derby. Friday morning brought a change in the weather. The crisp, clear autumn skies gave way to a low, brooding ceiling of grey cloud, heavy with the threat of rain. The village of Marlow Crossing, however, was crackling with a different kind of electricity. It was the eve of the Marlow-to-Hinton Derby. The Derby was not just a race, it was the financial heartbeat of the village's unofficial economy. Wagers were placed in hushed tones in the butcher's shop, slips of paper were passed silently across the bar of the Black Swan, and the local bookmaker, a man in the neighboring town who operated via telephone and a network of runners, was taking heavy action. The route, 50 miles straight across the county to the industrial town of Hinton, was notoriously difficult, cross-cutting prevailing winds and testing the endurance of the finest birds. Miss Marple wrapped her woolen scarf tighter around her neck as she walked toward the village green. The official loft-keeper's shed, a sturdy wooden structure resembling a small cricket pavilion, had been opened. Inside, the village men were gathered for the solemn ritual of ringing the birds. She stood near the open doorway, watching. It was a fascinating process. Each bird entered into the race was brought forward in a wicker basket. The official timer, a severe-looking man with a clipboard, carefully attached a rubber race ring over the bird's permanent metal identification ring. When the bird returned to its home loft, the owner would remove this rubber ring, drop it into a specially sealed timing clock, and turn the handle. The clock would stamp the exact time of arrival, locked inside a tamper-proof paper roll. It was an elegant, foolproof system. Unless, of course, the system itself was a facade. Miss Marple watched as the constable, acting on Inspector Loach's orders, oversaw the ringing of Arthur Finch's entry. Since Finch was dead, the village pigeon club had agreed to fly the bird in his honor. A young man carefully lifted a sleek, slate-grey pigeon from Finch's basket. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. She saw the metal band glint on the bird's leg. 4471 Ray. As the rubber race ring was slipped over it, she noticed something else. Attached to the metal band, barely thicker than a matchstick, was a tiny, lightweight aluminum capsule. It was standard equipment for some fanciers, occasionally used for carrying small slips of paper with training notes or return addresses. But seeing it now, on this specific ghost bird, a memory surfaced in Miss Marple's mind with the clarity of a struck bell. Years ago, during the war, she had known a woman in St. Mary Mead whose husband was an avid racing fan. The woman had once mentioned, with a charming, oblivious sort of pride, that her husband always seemed to know the racing results ahead of the board. He would place bets in the village pub minutes before the telegraph wire delivered the official results from London. He had claimed it was intuition. Miss Marple had wondered, at the time, how intuition could be so remarkably precise. She understood now. A pigeon flying 50 miles across country at 60 miles an hour is faster than a man driving on winding country roads. It is faster than the post. It is even faster, in some cases, than a congested telegraph line between two busy bookmakers. If a man in Marlow Crossing had a partner in Hinton, and if that partner had access to the early odds or the results of a major national sporting event, a tiny slip of paper tucked into a capsule on a bird's leg could carry that information across the county in less than an hour. The receiving partner could place enormous bets against outdated odds, exploiting the delay in communication. It was smuggling, pure and simple. Not of goods, but of information. and Arthur Finch had been flying 4471A, a bird with no official race history, on the exact route between the two towns. Miss Marple stepped back from the shed as the men began loading the baskets into the back of a rented lorry, which would drive the birds to Hinton for the release the following morning. Arthur Finch had discovered the perfect smuggling mechanism. But he had not been a clever man. He was a methodical man. Someone else had possessed the vision, the connections, the sheer audacity to set up the route. Arthur had merely been the caretaker, holding the birds, running the flights. And then, Miss Marple surmised, Arthur had grown greedy. He had realized the power he held. The ledger entries, he had documented the ghost birds, claiming them as his own, a silent threat to his partner. He had squeezed, and his partner had snapped. She turned away from the green, the chill of the wind finally biting through her coat. She knew the why. Now, she needed the who. And the answer, she was certain, would be found when Inspector Loach finally received the transfer records from London. Chapter 7. The Clock Without Hands. The storm broke just after midnight, lashing the windows of the Blue Boar in with heavy, driving rain. Miss Marple lay awake, listening to the wind howl down the chimney, her mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the village washed clean, the air smelling of wet earth and bruised leaves. It was Derby Day. But when she arrived at the village green at 8 o'clock, the atmosphere was not one of anticipation, but of chaotic panic. A crowd of men was clustered around the official loft keeper's shed. Voices were raised, arms waving in agitated gestures. Inspector Loach was standing in the doorway, his face thunderous, barking orders at Constable Davies. Miss Marple approached the edge of the crowd, tapping the baker on the arm. "Whatever is the matter, Mr. Clark?" "It's the timing clock, Miss Marple," the baker said, his face pale. "The master clock from the shed. The one that synchronizes all the individual loft clocks. It's gone. Stolen in the night." Miss Marple absorbed this information with a sharp intake of breath. The timing clock. Without the master clock, the entire timing system of the race collapsed. When the birds returned, their individual arrival times could not be officially verified against the master record. The race was ruined. Every result would be inadmissible, unverifiable. "But why on earth would someone steal the clock?" the baker muttered, shaking his head. "It's worthless to anyone outside the club. And it ruins the derby for everyone." Miss Marple did not answer him. She knew exactly why. Inspector Loach pushed his way through the crowd, looking exhausted and deeply frustrated. He saw Miss Marple and strode toward her, perhaps seeking a quiet voice amid the shouting. "A disaster," Loach growled, running a hand through his damp hair. "Someone broke the padlock on the shed during the storm. Smashed it with a hammer. Took the master clock and vanished. The entire race is compromised." "And what of Mr. Bernard Ashe?" Miss Marple asked softly. Loach's expression darkened further. "That's the worst part. I had Davies check his alibi. It's ironclad. He was at the Breeders' Market in Oakhaven on Tuesday evening. A dozen people saw him. He has a signed receipt time-stamped at 5:30, and he was seen drinking in the market pub until 7. He couldn't possibly have killed Arthur Finch. And he certainly didn't steal the clock last night. I had a constable watching his house because I still suspected him. He hasn't left his front door since 8 o'clock yesterday evening. The inspector looked entirely defeated. The red herring had dissolved, leaving him with nothing. No suspect, no motive, and now, an act of sabotage that seemed completely senseless. "Don't you see, Inspector?" Miss Marple said gently, her voice barely audible over the din of the angry pigeon fanciers. "The theft of the clock is not senseless. It is absolutely necessary." Loach stared at her. "Necessary? For what?" "For 4471A, she replied. "The bird entered in Arthur Finch's name. It was released in Hinton this morning, was it not?" "Yes, the lorry driver called it in. The birds went up at 7. Then the bird is flying back here right now. And attached to its leg, Inspector, is a small aluminum capsule. If that bird arrives, and its time is officially logged, someone will eventually examine that capsule. But if there is no official timing, if the race is effectively cancelled, the bird arrives, the owner quietly retrieves it, and no official record of its flight exists. The theft of the clock is a man covering his tracks. It is the final act of the murder." Loach's eyes widened as the procedural fog lifted. He saw the shape of it now. Not a feud over a silver cup. A criminal enterprise. "The transfer records," Loach said suddenly, his voice tight. "The post arrived an hour ago. The records from London are on my desk." "Then I suggest we look at them, Inspector," Miss Marple said, turning toward the police station. "I believe they will tell us exactly whose tracks are being covered." Chapter 8. A number that does not fly. The police station was quiet, a stark contrast to the shouting mob on the green. Inspector Loach spread the large, unwieldy sheets of the official Racing Association transfer records across his desk. They smelled of dry dust and bureaucratic ink. Miss Marple stood beside him, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. "Right," Loach said, running a thick finger down the columns of microscopic type. "Let's find them. 4471A and 4473A. The search took several minutes, tracking back through years of registrations, loft transfers, and breeder sales. Arthur Finch had indeed registered the birds under his own name in the local club records, as his almanac claimed. But the official National Registry, which tracked the metal bands from birth, told a different story. "Here," Loach said, his finger stopping abruptly near the bottom of a page dated 3 years prior. "Ring 4471A. And right below it, 4473A. He traced his finger across the page to the column listing the original registered owner and loft location. Miss Marple read the name aloud, her voice soft but carrying the weight of finality. "Wallace Dodd. The Willows, Marlow Crossing." Loach leaned back, exhaling a long, slow breath. Wallace Dodd. He was a prominent figure in the village, a man of 52 who ran a small, seemingly respectable business acting as a betting broker for the larger syndicates in London and Hinton. He was also a pigeon fancier, though his birds rarely placed in the top tier of local races. He was known for being polite, meticulous, and always impeccably dressed. He was the antithesis of the loud, blustering Bernard Ashe. Dodd transferred the birds to Finch 3 years ago, Loach said, processing the information. But Finch kept them hidden. Ghost birds. Used entirely for the smuggling run between Hinton and here. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. Mr. Dodd has the connections in Hinton. He has the betting ledgers. He understands the odds and the telegraph delays. He built the route. But he could not fly the birds from his own loft without drawing suspicion, especially if they were making irregular flights on days when there were no official races. So he used Finch. Finch had the secluded Dovecote at the edge of the village. Finch was the handler. Loach stood up, his energy returning. He grabbed his coat from the hook behind the door. I need to get a search warrant for Finch's cottage. If Dodd was using capsules to send the betting codes, there might be evidence left behind. I took the liberty, Inspector, of asking Constable Davies to retrieve the small wooden box from Mr. Finch's workbench while you were dealing with the crowd, Miss Marple said, pointing to a small evidence bag sitting on the edge of the desk. Loach looked at her, a mixture of astonishment and gratitude in his eyes. He opened the bag and spilled the contents onto the blotter. Among the spare aluminum rings were 3 tiny capsules. Loach unscrewed one. Inside, tightly rolled, was a small slip of tissue paper. He unrolled it carefully with the tip of his pen. It was covered in a tiny, precise shorthand. Numbers, fractions, and symbols that meant nothing to a layman, but everything to a bookmaker. Betting codes, Loach confirmed grimly. Proof of the operation. And the handwriting, I suspect, Miss Marple added gently, will not match Mr. Finch's cramped scrawl in his almanac. It will match the neat, precise hand of a man who keeps professional betting ledgers. The puzzle was complete. The mechanism of the crime was laid bare. But Miss Marple knew that understanding the how was only half the battle. To truly close the circle, one had to understand the why. And the why of Wallace Dodd, she suspected, was a tragedy of pride that went far deeper than a few stolen pounds. Inspector, she said, wrapping her scarf around her neck once more. While you secure your warrant for Mr. Dodd's arrest, I wonder if you might allow me a few moments alone with him first. At his home. Loach frowned. Miss Marple, he's a murderer. He pushed a man off a ladder. He's dangerous. He is a desperate man, Inspector, who has run out of moves, she replied, her pale eyes perfectly calm. He killed Arthur Finch because Finch threatened his pride and his life's work. He will not harm me. I only wish to understand the rest of the story before the cell door closes. Loach hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'll be in the car outside. 5 minutes. Then I'm coming in. Chapter 9. Wallace Dodd's garden. The Willows was a neat, detached house on the better side of Marlow Crossing. It possessed a manicured lawn, a freshly painted white gate, and a garden that was regimented with military precision. The rosebushes were pruned back sharply, the gravel path was raked free of leaves, and the pigeon loft at the rear of the property was painted a pristine, spotless white. It was the home of a man who demanded absolute control over his environment. Miss Marple walked up the gravel path, the crunch of her sensible shoes loud in the quiet morning air. Inspector Loach was parked 50 yards down the lane, out of sight. She knocked on the front door. It was opened almost immediately by Wallace Dodd. He was dressed in a tweed waistcoat and perfectly pressed trousers, his silver hair combed back severely from his forehead. He looked entirely composed, though there was a faint tightness around his eyes, a microscopic tension in his jaw. Miss Marple, isn't it? Dodd said, his voice smooth and cultured. From the Blue Boar. We haven't formally met, but one hears things in a small village. How may I help you? Good morning, Mr. Dodd, she said, offering a polite, vague smile. I do hope I am not disturbing you. I was admiring your garden. It is quite beautifully kept. So unlike poor Mr. Finch's wilderness. A shadow, brief and cold, flickered across Dodd's eyes at the mention of Finch's name. Arthur was a man focused entirely on his birds. He had little time for aesthetics. Was there something specific you wanted, madam? Only a moment of your time, she said, stepping past him into the hallway before he could refuse. The interior of the house was just as immaculate as the garden. It smelled of lemon polish and expensive pipe tobacco. Dodd closed the door, his composure slipping a fraction of an inch. I'm rather busy this morning, Miss Marple. The Derby, you know. Or what's left of it, after that disgraceful business with the clock. Ah, yes. The clock, Miss Marple murmured, walking slowly toward the rear window that looked out over the garden. A terrible shame. Though, entirely necessary, wasn't it? To protect 4471 Ray. The silence in the hallway became absolute. It was thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Dodd did not move. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its smooth veneer. It was flat and hard. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. Miss Marple turned to face him, her expression one of deep, sorrowful understanding. I think you do, Mr. Dodd. The official transfer records arrived this morning. The ghost birds in Arthur's loft. The capsules. The shorthand on the tissue paper. Inspector Loach is outside, reviewing the warrant. It is all over, you see. Dodd stared at her, his hands slowly clenching into fists at his sides. The mask of the respectable betting broker was disintegrating, revealing the exhausted, cornered man beneath. Miss Marple looked back out the window, her gaze resting on a small, neatly built wooden shed at the far end of the garden, tucked behind a row of immaculate conifers. You keep everything so tidy, Mr. Dodd. Everything in its place. I imagine, if the inspector were to look behind that very tidy garden shed, beneath a top perhaps, he would find the master timing clock you removed last night in the rain. Dodd closed his eyes. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once, his shoulders slumping. He looked suddenly older, smaller. He was bleeding me dry, Dodd whispered, the words torn from a place of deep, festering bitterness. For 3 years, he bled me. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She simply listened, knowing that the hardest part of a confession is not admitting the act, but explaining the agony that led to it. Chapter 10. What the Almanac Remembered. Wallace Dodd moved slowly into the sitting room and collapsed into a high-backed leather armchair. He did not offer Miss Marple a seat, but she took one anyway, perching on the edge of a floral sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It was my idea, Dodd began, his gaze fixed on the unlit fireplace. The whole operation. I realized, years ago, that the telegraph delays between the bookmakers in Hinton and the tracks in London created a window. A tiny window, perhaps 20 minutes, where the results were known in one place but not the other. If you could move that information faster than the wire, you could place bets on certainties, Miss Marple finished quietly. A guaranteed fortune. Yes. But I needed a mechanism. The birds. I bred them, I trained them. 4471A and 4473A were my finest. Faster than anything in the county. But I couldn't fly them from my loft. My business is too public. If I was seen sending and receiving birds at odd hours, questions would be asked. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. So, I brought Arthur Finch in. He was a nobody. A quiet man at the edge of town with a dirty loft. I transferred the birds to him. I set up the Hinton connection. I gave him the capsules. All he had to do was release them when my man in Hinton called, and catch them when they returned. I paid him 20% of the take. More money than he had ever seen in his life. Miss Marple nodded. She could see the arrangement perfectly. The architect and the bricklayer. But architects often underestimate the ambition of the men who lay the stones. And then, she prompted gently, he wanted more. Dodd let out a harsh, dry laugh. More? Yes. At first, it was 30%. Then 40%. He said he was taking all the risk, holding the birds. He started keeping that damned almanac. Writing the ring numbers down, documenting the ghost flights alongside his official races. He was building a ledger of my guilt, disguised as his own hobby. He told me last week that if I didn't give him a full 50% half of my operation, my brilliance, he would leave the almanac where the racing committee could find it. Blackmail, Miss Marple murmured. Extortion, Dodd spat. He took my idea, my birds, my money. And to make matters worse. He paused, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. To make matters worse, his legitimate racing birds were beating mine. Every Saturday. He stood there on the green, with that smug, stupid look on his face, taking the prize money, while holding a knife to my throat in private. The postmistress's words echoed in Miss Marple's mind. A man with a secret. A very smug sort of look. Arthur Finch had not just wanted money, he had wanted to humiliate the man who had hired him. He had enjoyed the power. You went to the cottage on Tuesday evening, Miss Marple stated, a statement of fact rather than a question. I went to reason with him, Dodd said, his voice dropping to a whisper. To offer him 45%. I walked into the garden. He was up on the ladder, reaching into the top tier. He didn't even look down. He just said, 50%, Wallace. Or the book goes to the inspector. He laughed. He actually laughed at me. Dodd stared at his hands. I didn't plan it. I swear to God, I didn't go there to kill him. But I looked at him up there, so arrogant, so entirely in control of my life, and I just kicked the ladder. I kicked it as hard as I could. He fell. There was a crack. And then, nothing. The room fell silent. Outside, the distant sound of a car engine shutting off could be heard. Inspector Loach was walking up the path. Miss Marple looked at Wallace Dodd. She felt no triumph, only a profound sense of weariness. She had seen it so many times before. The corruption of the soul by degrees. I knew a church warden once, she said softly, rising from the sofa. A respected man. He kept what he called the Lord's accounts in a private ledger. Moving a few pounds here and there from the collection plate to pay for a poor family's coal, he told himself. For good reasons. But years later, the money was gone, the reasons were forgotten, and the ledger was just a record of his theft. These arrangements, Mr. Dodd. They always begin with brilliance and justification. But they always end in the dirt. Chapter 11. The Confession in the Dovecote. The heavy thud of the brass knocker echoed through the hallway. Wallace Dodd did not move to answer it. He remained in his leather chair, a man who had finally stopped running from his own shadow. Miss Marple walked to the door and opened it. Inspector Loach stood on the step, 2 uniformed constables behind him. He looked past Miss Marple, his eyes locking onto Dodd in the sitting room. "Wallace Dodd," Loach said, his voice filling the house with official weight. "I am arresting you for the murder of Arthur Finch. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be given in evidence." Dodd stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his waistcoat in a final, pathetic gesture of respectability. He offered no resistance as the constables stepped forward and placed a hand on each of his arms. "The timing clock, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly as they led him past. "You will find it behind the garden shed, I believe. Under a tarpaulin." Loach nodded curtly to one of the constables, who immediately jogged down the side path toward the rear garden. A moment later, he returned, carrying the heavy, brass-bound master clock, its glass face smeared with rain and dirt. Dodd looked at the clock, and then at Miss Marple. "It wouldn't have mattered anyway, would it?" he said, his voice flat. "Even if I stopped the race." "You already knew about the birds." "The birds were the truth, Mr. Dodd," she replied. "And the truth always returns to roost, eventually." As they led him down the gravel path toward the police car, the village of Marlow Crossing seemed to hold its collective breath. Neighbors peered from behind lace curtains. The baker stood at his shop door, his hands white with flour. Bernard Ashe, walking down the lane, stopped and stared, the loud, aggressive bluster entirely wiped from his face, replaced by a stunned, silent shock. The red herring had realized how close he had come to the frying pan. Loach paused by the car door and turned back to Miss Marple. "You were right," he said, the gruffness gone from his voice. "About the almanac. About the birds. How did you know he would confess so easily to you?" "Because, Inspector, he was exhausted," she said, adjusting her hat against the breeze. "Carrying a secret of that magnitude, living with the daily humiliation of Arthur Finch's blackmail, it is a terrible burden. When I told him it was over, he didn't feel fear. He felt relief. He wanted to explain why he did it, because to him, the why justifies the how. It never does, of course, but men must tell themselves stories to survive." Loach nodded slowly, absorbing the wisdom of the old woman from St. Mary Mead. "I'll have to take your statement, Miss Marple." "Formalities." "Of course, Inspector. I shall be at the Blue Boar, having a cup of tea. It has been a rather taxing morning." She watched as the police car pulled away, taking Wallace Dodd away from his immaculate garden, his respectable life, and his deadly pride. The street was quiet again. The puzzle was solved. The ledger was closed. But there was one final piece of the story left to play out. Miss Marple looked up at the sky. The heavy clouds were beginning to break, revealing patches of pale, washed-out blue. It was time for the birds to come home. Chapter 12. The race runs on. By mid-afternoon, the crisis of the missing timing clock had been resolved. Inspector Loach, displaying a surprising degree of bureaucratic agility, had contacted the Regional Racing Association by telephone. Because the master clock had been recovered undamaged, and because Constable Davies had supervised the ringing of the birds the day before, the association agreed to allow the race results to stand, provided Loach himself oversaw the opening of the individual loft clocks. The village green, which had been a site of panic that morning, was now a place of silent, upward-looking tension. Miss Marple stood near the post office, standing beside Mrs. Lumley, who had abandoned her counter for the rare spectacle. The air was crisp again, the wind dying down as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. "They should be arriving soon," Mrs. Lumley whispered, her eyes squinting against the glare. "If the headwind hasn't held them back." At precisely 3:15, a shout went up from the far end of the green. "There! Over the ridge!" A tiny speck appeared in the sky, high and fast, a bullet of slate and muscle tearing through the cold air. It banked sharply, identifying its home loft, and then plummeted toward the village in a breathtaking stoop. It was a blue checker, owned by the baker. A cheer went up as the bird hit the traps, and the baker scrambled to remove the rubber ring and drop it into his clock. Over the next hour, the sky filled with returning birds. They arrived in ones and twos, exhausted, magnificent, diving toward their lofts across the village. The air was filled with the sound of whirring wings and the sharp, satisfying clack of the timing clocks being struck. But down at the end of the village, at the damp cottage near the river, the grand wooden dovecote remained silent. Constable Davies stood near the gate, watching the sky. Just before 4 o'clock, a lone bird appeared. It flew lower than the others, its wing beats heavy with fatigue. It circled the slate roof of Finch's loft once, twice, and then fluttered down to land on the landing board. It was a sleek, slate-grey pigeon. On its leg, glinting in the late afternoon sun, was a metal band, and a tiny aluminum capsule. 4471A had completed its final smuggling run. But there was no Arthur Finch to receive it. There was no Wallace Dodd waiting by a telephone. The bird strutted back and forth for a moment, confused by the closed traps, before finally settling down, tucking its head into its feathers to rest. The secret it carried was no longer a threat, it was just a piece of paper, powerless and obsolete. Miss Marple smiled softly, a quiet, melancholic smile. The village of Marlow Crossing would recover. The wages would be settled, the pints would be poured, and next Saturday, the sky would fill with birds once again. The tragedy of Arthur Finch and Wallace Dodd would fade into local legend, a cautionary tale told over dark ale in the Black Swan. She turned and began the slow walk back to the Blue Boar Inn. Her replumbing in St. Mary Mead would surely be finished soon. It was time to go home. Thank you for spending this hour with me. I'm Jack, this has been Midnight Pages, and if this one stayed with you the way it stayed with me, leave me a thought in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't, share this with someone who loves a good mystery, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Until then, sleep well, and watch what grows in the quiet places.